We started this day with the counter at 64.15 kilos. Not bad at all. It took us a few solid visits to get there. But today's a big one, because by the end of this harvest, we're clocking in at 148.7 kilos total. Yep, that's a record. An increase of 84.55 kilos in one day. And if you're watching the counter in the top left, you'll see it tick along as we weigh each bag and box, one by one. Like a game show, but with vegetables and more dirt. Now, if you're wondering how we managed to harvest that much in one go, it starts with the brassicas. Yep, we've been talking about them for weeks. The broccoli, the cauliflower, the kale like chaos. And now, it was finally time to clear most of them out. Not every plant gave us a perfect head. Some started strong and got weird halfway. Others never even tried. But here's the surprise. The leaves, the part most people forget about, they turned out to be the main event. We harvested crate after crate of big, sturdy, healthy brassica leaves. And it turns out, Stichting Vikes, our donation partner, is all about them. Seriously. Their team told us these leaves are popular in the neighborhood. They get stewed, sautéed, chopped up into soups, even wrapped around rice and veg. We're not just clearing space in the garden. We're filling plates with food that people want. So what started as a salvage harvest kind of day turned into one of our most useful, heaviest, and most appreciated harvests yet. We also pulled some celery, a handful of beets, and a good batch of beet greens. All in all, a very green, very leafy, very satisfying haul. And yes, it was a long day. There's a reason we didn't film every single part of it. At some point, both hands were busy with mud, bags, crates, slugs, maybe a coffee, and probably a lost glove. But what we did capture will give you a solid look behind the scenes. What the garden looks like now, what we had to clear out, and what's about to take over next. Because while the brassicas are mostly out, the courgettes are moving in fast. So grab your shovel or your snack or both, and let's see how this record day came together. So, we've made some serious progress today, but this isn't the end of the harvest. Not by a long shot. We've cleared out the brassicas, but there's still plenty left to tackle. The garden's about to get a whole lot busier with what's coming next. As you can see, the leaves are in, and the courgettes are already eyeing their spot to take over. Things are moving fast, and the work is piling up. But that's the beauty of it all. It's a never-ending cycle of growth, harvest, and giving back. We've got more to come, more to plant, and definitely more to harvest. So stick with us, because today's harvest is just the beginning. All right, let's kick things off with what we're all here for, the brassicas, or as I like to call them, the superstars of today's harvest. You've been seeing them grow for weeks, those proud broccoli heads, the cauliflower. That started off with big promises, but, well, didn't quite deliver. And let's not forget the kale. It's the leafy green that's always ready to step up when other vegetables are too tired to perform. Now, brassicas are a family of plants that love the cooler weather, and it turns out they're pretty tough. Broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, all part of the Brassica Club, and they've been known to handle a little bit of cold, a bit of wind, and in some cases, a bit too much attention from the local slug population. So, what's the deal? With today's harvest, why are we pulling them out now? Well, simple. It's all about timing. Brassicas, like broccoli and cauliflower, have a limited window where they're perfect for harvest. Too early and they're underdeveloped. Too late and they start to bolt, sending out flowers when you just wanted some nice heads of cabbage. It's a tricky balance. We're harvesting today because the heads are big enough, but not too big. The cauliflower heads are starting to look like they've had a little too much sun, a little too excited to be on the garden stage. And the broccoli is at its peak. If we wait any longer, we risk the whole thing turning into a cabbage patch gone wild. So, it's time to pull them up while they're still at their best. But here's where it gets interesting. Did you know that these plants actually have a pretty fascinating history? Brassicas have been cultivated for thousands of years, and not just for eating. The ancient Romans were pretty fond of their cabbage, but they didn't just toss it in a salad. No, they used it as medicine. And let's not forget about kale. It was actually the most popular green vegetable in America until the 1940s. Yes, kale was once king. Now, if you've been following along, you know that brassicas can be a bit dramatic. Broccoli can be fickle. Sometimes it grows like it's ready for an Oscar nomination, and other times it's just a sad little green bush. Cauliflower? Don't even get me started. It's like the celebrity of the garden. It needs perfect growing conditions, a little bit of hand-holding, and then, just when you think you've got it figured out, it decides to show up fashionably late, if at all. And the kale, don't get me wrong, I love kale. But it's basically the garden's version of that one friend who shows up to every party, eats all the snacks, and then leaves before anyone even notices they were there. But you know what? We can always count on kale to put on a good show. It's the reliable, green, and let's be real, it's tough as nails. Even when the weather's rough, kale's out here like, I've got this. So today, we're clearing them out. Some of the plants didn't quite make it to the finish line, and some of them were a bit overzealous in the growth department. But that's all part of the process. It's like cleaning out your closet. Some things have to go, but others, they've got a second life. And in this case, the leaves that we're pulling off, well, they're just as useful as the heads. We're not just clearing space, we're preparing for a new chapter. You see, it turns out the brassica leaves, those big, sturdy, beautiful leaves, are not only delicious, but they're also a big hit with our donation partner, Stichting Vikes. They told us these leaves are a favorite in the neighborhood. They're stewed, sautéed, chopped into soups, and even wrapped around rice and vegetables. So don't be fooled by their tough exterior. Brassica leaves are the real stars of the show. And we're not just talking about the heads anymore. The whole plant has its moment to shine. Today, we've harvested crate after crate of these hardy leaves. And while we might have thought we were just clearing space for the next crop, it turns out we're filling some plates with delicious, nutritious food that people actually want. Who knew the leaves would be the ones to steal the spotlight? Of course, not every plant was a winner. Some of the broccoli heads decided they didn't want to show up for the big harvest today. But that's the thing with brassicas. They can be a bit unpredictable. Some plants thrive, and some just don't get the memo. But hey, that's gardening, right? You win some, you lose some. So, as we pull out the last of the brassicas, we're left with a garden that's ready for what comes next. Sure, it's a little empty right now, but that's just the calm before the next storm of growth. The brassicas have done their job, and now it's time to make room for something new. And don't worry, we'll make sure the garden is filled with the next generation of plants, ready to pick up where the brassicas left off. Before we start chopping brassicas left and right, here's a little confession. We didn't figure this all out on our own. Behind the scenes, well, actually sometimes right on screen, we've got help from our very own AI gardening buddy. Built by us, trained on our notes, shaped by trial and error, and occasionally wrong in the most hilarious ways. It doesn't plant or harvest, yet, but it does help us think. It reminds us of what we did last year, what worked, what didn't, and how not to repeat the same mistake 5 times in a row. It nudges us when we forget a seedling might already be growing underneath. It's not perfect, but neither are we, and that's kind of the point. It makes us stop and reconsider before we act. So as we walk through the garden today, making decisions plant by plant, know that we're not just going with gut feeling. We're listening to the soil, to the plants, and yeah, sometimes to a little voice coming from a laptop. Let's get into it. The brassicas are ready, or nearly ready, and we've got to decide who stays, who goes, and how we make space without wrecking what's already thriving below. Hello, AI buddy. I have 3 M2 space left in a shady spot. What can I grow there? Don't include herbs.
Although many vegetables and fruits prefer full sun, there are several types of plants that can tolerate and even thrive in shady spots. Leafy greens, spinach, Swiss chard, and kale don't need as much sunlight as some other vegetables.
Our AI gardening buddy helps us think a little clearer and dig a little smarter. We've built it for ourselves, but you can try it too. Sign up for free. Link in the description. Now, back to the real work. We've got a whole row of brassicas staring us down. Some might get another week. Others, they've done their part, but we're not just pulling plants. We're planning around what's growing beneath. Let's walk through it, one decision at a time. All right, let's take a deep dive into our brassicas today. It's been a season full of growth, excitement, and let's face it, some serious head scratching. But the time has come to make some tough decisions. As we look at the patch of cauliflower, broccoli, and kale that's been occupying the garden space, we have to ask, what's worth keeping and what's time to say goodbye to? So, we begin with the cauliflower. Cauliflower is one of those plants that can either make you look like a gardening hero or leave you feeling a little defeated. It's a plant that demands attention and specific conditions, and when it's happy, it rewards you with those beautiful, compact, and pristine white heads. But when it's not happy, let's just say it's not shy about showing it. Sometimes it seems like everything's going great at first, and then, boom, we hit a rough patch. The cauliflower starts showing signs of distress. Either it bolts prematurely or the head gets all weird and loose. So what do? The decision is easy in some cases. If a cauliflower has been stunted and hasn't produced a usable head by now, it's out. We can't afford to keep a plant that isn't pulling its weight. The space in our garden is too valuable, and we need to make room for crops that are performing. But it's not always so cut and dry. Sometimes we look at the cauliflower, and it's small but healthy. It's still trying, and with a little extra love, it could reach its full potential. But the question then becomes, how much time do we have to invest in a plant that might not be able to fully mature in time? That's a hard one. So, in some cases, we make the call to give it another week or two, just to see if it can rally. But if we're being honest, if the cauliflower hasn't made a solid move by this point, it's likely to end up on the compost pile. Now let's talk about the broccoli. Oh, broccoli. We've had a bit of a love-hate relationship with this vegetable. It's a bit more forgiving than cauliflower, but it also requires its fair share of attention. Broccoli, when it's happy, is one of the easiest plants to grow. You get these beautiful dense heads that are perfect for stir-fries, soups, and even just steaming with a little butter and salt. But when broccoli is unhappy, well, it lets you know. Those once tight florets start loosening up and opening, up into this frizzy mess that looks like it belongs in a cartoon. You've got to act fast when that happens. So, what's the verdict? If we catch the broccoli before it goes completely to seed, we can sometimes salvage a nice bunch of florets. But if we let it go too long, it's a goner. It's important to stay vigilant with the broccoli, checking the heads regularly to ensure they're tight and dense. Once they start opening up, it's game over. At that point, we need to make the hard decision. Time to pull it out. No sense in leaving it in the ground for too long, taking up valuable space that other plants can use. We need room for new, thriving crops. Kale, on the other hand, is a bit of a different beast. Kale is tough, resilient, and often more willing to stick around longer than its fellow brassicas. But just because kale can survive doesn't mean it's always the best option. We look at the kale leaves to see if they're still tender and healthy. If they're starting to get tough and woody, it's time to say goodbye. If we're not getting the quality we need from the kale, it's time to clear out the patch and make room for something else. But if the kale is still thriving, we might just let it go a little longer. It's a constant evaluation process. And as we pull out some of these plants, we have to keep asking ourselves, is it really time or is there still hope? Ultimately, the decision to pull out a brassica isn't just about how big the head is or whether it's mature enough. It's about looking at the overall plant health, its space in the garden, and the plants surrounding it. We can't afford to keep a plant that's not giving us what we need, But at the same time, we also don't want to prematurely remove a plant that still has potential to provide a decent harvest. So, we'll keep making those decisions one by one until we've evaluated every brassica in the garden. Okay, now that we've examined our brassicas in detail, it's time to move to the heart of the decision-making process. What stays and what goes. The garden is all about tough calls, and sometimes the hardest part isn't planting the seeds. It's knowing when to pull the plug on a plant that's no longer thriving. In this segment, we'll dive into why it's crucial to make these tough decisions in the best interest of the garden's overall health, and why sometimes it's more about the bigger picture than just a plant's performance. Let's start with the cauliflower. Now, I've seen cauliflower plants that started out strong, healthy, and full of promise. Those little green leaves would sprout up in neat rows, and I'd think to myself, this is going to be great. And yet, as the weeks went by, I found that for whatever reason, the heads just didn't form. Maybe the weather turned too hot for it to flourish, or perhaps it was planted too late. But what do we do in situations like this? Do we keep the plant around, just in case it turns around? Or do we pull it out and make room for something that might produce? One factor that heavily influences this decision is timing. Cauliflower has a window of opportunity in the growing season. If you wait too long and it starts to go to seed, you've lost your chance. But here's where things get tricky. Cauliflower can be a bit temperamental. If the weather's not ideal or the plant hasn't gotten enough nutrients, it might take a little longer to mature. So, while it's tempting to pull out a small, underwhelming cauliflower, sometimes it might just need a little more time. It's a judgment call, but ultimately, the biggest deciding factor is space. Space is valuable in the garden, and it's limited. If there's another plant ready to take that spot and it needs the sunlight or nutrients that the cauliflower can't provide, the cauliflower has to go. That's the reality of garden management. We can't afford to let one slow-growing plant take up the space that could be used by something more productive. So, it's out with the old cauliflower and in with a plant that can produce. Then we have the broccoli. Oh, broccoli. Broccoli is one of those crops that you can't afford to neglect. It's not as resilient as some other brassicas, and if you wait too long to harvest it, the florets start opening up, loosening, and turning into these spindly little branches. This is the moment when you know your broccoli is no longer the beautiful head it once was. It's either over-matured or heading straight for seed production, which is great if you're saving seeds, but not so ideal if you're hoping for a delicious harvest. One of the hardest things about broccoli is knowing when to pull it out. Unlike cauliflower, which can sometimes be coaxed into producing a decent head, broccoli is far more time-sensitive. If you leave it too long, you end up with a mess of loose florets that are practically useless. But sometimes you might catch a head just before it starts opening up. In these cases, you make the decision based on the size of the head and whether it still looks healthy. If the florets are tight and dense, you might decide to give it one last chance. But if even the slightest bit of opening has started, it's out. And just like that, we're down another brassica. Kale, on the other hand, can be a bit more forgiving. It's one of those plants that, if kept well, will give you a steady stream of leaves throughout the growing season. But not all kale is created equal. Some varieties thrive longer than others, and you have to decide when it's best to cut them down. If the leaves are still tender and growing well, there's no reason to remove the plant. But if the leaves start getting tough or the plant becomes too woody, it's time to let go. Just like with cauliflower and broccoli, kale takes up precious space in the garden. If it's no longer producing quality leaves, it's time to pull it and replace it with something more productive. And here's where the space issue comes into play. Let's say we've got a row of kale that's producing fewer and fewer leaves. In the meantime, the zucchini next door is growing fast, and the beans are beginning to climb their trellises. We need to make decisions based on how each plant fits into the overall layout of the garden. Sometimes it's not just about whether the plant has potential, It's about what other plants are vying for that spot and whether they can make better use of the space. Now, there are some plants that we don't remove immediately, even when they're struggling. For example, if a broccoli plant hasn't formed a good head yet, but there's still a chance, we might give it another week or two. However, if we have another crop, like tomatoes or cucumbers, that needs the space to grow, that's a different story. The timing of these decisions is often dictated by the season. As the days get warmer and the growing season continues, the plants need to be making progress, not staying stagnant. So, we pull out those that have reached their peak or have proven to be too slow to deliver. The overall lesson here is that garden management is about more than just watching your plants grow. It's about making calculated decisions based on the current health of each plant, the timing of the season, and the space that each plant requires. As much as we want to nurture every plant to the very end, sometimes it's just not practical. And that's okay. The decision to remove a brassica, or any plant for that matter, isn't always about failure. It's about making space for something that will give you better results, whether that's another round of brassicas or a new crop entirely. In the end, it's all about the bigger picture and making sure the garden is as productive as it can be. All right, so we've made our decisions. The brassicas that aren't pulling their weight have been removed, and now we're left with the important task of considering what comes next. But before we rush to fill those gaps with new plants, there's something we need to address. How we remove these plants and what we do with the roots. It might seem like a small detail, but trust me, it makes a huge difference in how the garden performs in the long run. When we pull out these brassicas, we don't yank them out by the roots. We cut the stems at the base of the plant, leaving the roots in the ground. Why, you ask? Well, here's the thing. The roots are an integral part of the soil ecosystem. They help maintain the soil structure, prevent erosion, and most importantly, they break down over time to release valuable nutrients back into the soil. If we were to pull out the roots, we'd be disturbing the soil, which is not something we want to do. You see, healthy soil is the foundation of a healthy garden. If we start pulling out the roots, we're compromising that soil structure. The soil could become compacted, lose nutrients, or even start eroding if exposed to the elements. By leaving the roots in place, we allow them to break down naturally and contribute organic matter to the soil. This organic matter enriches the soil, providing essential nutrients for the next round of plants. But that's not all. The roots also provide a home for soil organisms like worms and microbes. These creatures rely on the organic material left by the roots to thrive. As the roots break down, they feed the microbes, which in turn break down the organic material into usable nutrients. The worms benefit from this process too, tunneling through the soil and improving aeration. All of this leads to healthier soil, which in turn leads to healthier plants. It's a slow process, but it's a crucial one. Another benefit of leaving the roots behind is that it helps to keep the soil in place. When we remove the entire plant, the exposed soil becomes vulnerable to erosion. This is especially true during heavy rains when the loose soil can wash away. By leaving the roots in place, we're essentially helping to anchor the soil, reducing the risk of erosion. This is something that many gardeners overlook, but it's one of those little things that can have a big impact over time. So instead of pulling out the entire plant, we cut it at the base. The roots stay intact, and we're not disturbing the soil. Over time, those roots decompose, enriching the soil and providing food for the next generation of plants. It's a win-win, but it's not just about leaving the roots behind. It's also about creating a healthy cycle of plant growth and decomposition. By doing this, we're building a sustainable garden that will continue to thrive year after year. We're also helping to foster a healthy ecosystem in the garden. The decomposing roots provide food for a variety of creatures that play a vital role in the soil ecosystem. These include fungi, bacteria, and other decomposers that break down the plant matter and release nutrients back into the soil. This process is essential for maintaining soil health and ensuring that future plants have access to the nutrients they need to grow strong. So, when you're removing your brassicas, remember that the roots are more valuable than they might seem at first glance. Leave them in place and let nature do its thing. In the long run, this practice will pay off with healthier soil, better plant growth, and a more productive garden. As we wrap up the brassica removal process, we're left with some important final considerations. What happens after we've made space and preserved the soil? It's all about creating a thriving ecosystem that supports the next round of plants and makes sure the garden stays in balance. The health of our soil, the types of crops we choose, and how we manage our resources all come into play. First and foremost, we need to think about the crops we want to plant next. This is where companion planting becomes crucial. Different plants have different needs, and some plants work better together than others. For example, beans are nitrogen fixers, which means they put nitrogen back into the soil, benefiting plants that need nitrogen, like corn and tomatoes. But there are also plants that shouldn't be planted together, like broccoli and cabbage, which can compete for space and nutrients. By considering which plants work well together, we can ensure that our garden isn't just a random collection of plants, but a carefully planned ecosystem that maximizes the available space and resources. Not only does this make the garden more productive, but it also helps to reduce the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Plants that grow well together naturally support each other, reducing competition and improving overall plant health. Once we've made our decisions on what to plant next, we need to focus on replenishing the soil. After removing plants and leaving the roots behind, the soil can start to feel a little depleted. This is when composting and adding organic matter becomes essential. Compost is like a magic elixir for the soil. It provides nutrients, improves drainage, and helps retain moisture. It's one of the best ways to ensure that the soil stays healthy and productive. We also need to pay attention to soil pH and texture. Different plants have different preferences when it comes to soil pH, and knowing what works for your crops can make all the difference. For example, some plants, like blueberries, prefer acidic soil, while others, like asparagus, thrive in more alkaline conditions. Understanding the needs of your crops and adjusting the soil accordingly can help you achieve the best possible results. In addition to soil care, water management is key. We all know that plants need water to grow, but the way we water our garden can make a huge difference in its health. Overwatering can drown plants, while underwatering can stress them out. Drip irrigation is a great way to ensure that plants get the right amount of water at the right time. Mulching is also important because it helps retain moisture and prevents weeds from taking over. At the end of the day, garden management is all about creating a balanced ecosystem. By making thoughtful decisions about which plants to grow, how to care for the soil, and how to manage resources, we can create a thriving, productive garden that continues to support itself year after year. It takes patience, care, and a deep understanding of the plants we grow, but the rewards are absolutely worth it. In this time-lapse, we'll take you through the fascinating process of harvesting our brassicas, broccoli, cauliflower, and kale, showing not only the harvest itself, but also the important decisions we make to keep the garden healthy and productive. The journey begins with inspecting the plants. Each type of brassica has its own characteristics and needs. Broccoli, cauliflower, and kale may look similar, but they all require different care. Timing is key. Waiting too long can affect the quality of the harvest, while harvesting too early means we haven't allowed the plants to reach their full potential. It's all about striking a balance between patience and understanding that space in the garden is limited and we need to use it wisely. When we decide to remove a plant, we think carefully about what's best for the long-term health of the garden. Sometimes this means pulling a plant even if it's still in decent shape, because other plants might benefit from the extra space. We don't uproot the brassicas entirely. We cut them at the base, leaving the roots intact. This way, we preserve the soil structure and ensure the roots stay in the ground to decompose and enrich the soil for future plants. It's a simple yet effective way to nurture the soil's health. The harvesting process itself is meticulous. For the broccoli, timing is especially important. The heads can start to flower quickly if left too long. Cauliflower is a bit more forgiving, but it also requires attention to ensure we harvest it at its peak. Kale is a bit more resilient and often keeps producing leaves for a longer period, so we have to decide when it's time to say goodbye to the plant and make room for new growth. We also pay attention to the surrounding environment. If a brassica has outgrown its space and is being overshadowed by other plants, it's time to let it go. In some cases, we may leave a brassica if nothing else is growing underneath it. But if we've already planted something like cucumbers beneath it, that brassica is out of there. We prioritize the plants that are actively growing and will benefit from the available space. One of the key takeaways from this process is that every decision is made with the garden's ecosystem in mind. The goal is not just to clear out plants, but to keep the garden in balance with healthy soil and thriving plants. By cutting down the brassicas instead of pulling them out, we protect the soil, preserve the nutrients, and set up the next round of crops for success. As we continue with the harvest, we also keep an eye on the soil's condition. Once we've cleared out some plants, we make sure to replenish the nutrients by adding compost and organic matter. This gives the soil the boost it needs to support the new plants coming in. So while this time lapse shows the physical labor of harvesting, it's also a glimpse into the careful planning and thoughtful decisions that go into creating a garden that not only produces but continues to thrive season after season. With most of the cauliflower and broccoli now gone, the garden looks much emptier, especially when viewed from above. It's definitely a bit bare, but that's just part of the cycle. The space will soon be filled with new growth and the garden will quickly bounce back. Here's the final shot of today's harvest. We're so grateful for our amazing partners who take in our donations and distribute them where they're needed most. It's incredible to see the positive impact grow. If you're inspired, don't forget to like, follow, and share. Join the movement. Together, we can make a real difference. You can grow it.